Religious belief of any kind is defined by the sum of two key elements: the text and the interpretation. So, the historical texts you and I have access to today through means of all of the documentaries, books, articles that are found online today. We have a lot of access to these ancient texts. However, the interpretation that has been given for these texts that has shaped the culture, the identity, and the lifestyle of people who follow these texts as the truth has been decided by other people in the past. When studying religion historically, we separate ourselves from the orthodox versus heresy argument because historically that argument was created and used as a means of basically condemning people to hell and death. I'm Lady Spliff, and this is my channel. I'm going to be talking about all of these various texts, and I'm going to try to correlate, compare, and offer alternative interpretations to these texts. If spirituality, religion, God, quantum physics, numerology, astrology, alchemy, magic, universal laws that make up reality, if these topics are things that you are interested in or want to learn more about, go ahead and subscribe because my channel is for you.
Classicism is the adherence to traditional standards that are universally and enduringly valid.
So classicism is this idea that the older philosophical thought or religious theological thought is, the more correct it is, the more pure it is. If you think about the analogy of like a ripple in a pond, wherever the source of the rock that was thrown in is the strongest amount of energy, and even though you see the rippled wave effect over time and it does reach people on the other end of the pond, the ripple that reaches you is technically so far away from the source. You know, the game telephone as we were kids. The first person says the true sentence, and the last person, as it comes back around, probably has some differing facts or differing words than originally created. So some people will also have this firm idea of antiquity as this starting progression of humanity, in the sense that there's this caveman mentality or this inability to have any sort of advanced civilization, and that the older you get, the farther back in history you get, the dumber humanity is, or the more incapable we are, and how great we are now in the future, that how far we've come and all of that. However, I am one who believes that there was in antiquity a very highly advanced civilization, and the things that have come from that time period, the ripples that have reached us in our time period, are obviously not the pure version of reality during that time period. We're going to start off our conversation and studies about religion by starting off with the religion of alchemy. And yeah, I said religion of alchemy. And I'm sure you're saying, hey, wait, isn't alchemy like a whole bunch of old guys in some, candlelit backroom science lab trying to turn stuff into gold? Or isn't that like demonic black magic, sorcery, Satanism type stuff? And there's a reason that you correlate those two ideas with alchemy if you haven't studied it or don't know anything about it. And the reason for that is because alchemy has been a victim of this politically motivated propaganda in our past, from a religious and historical perspective. But the interesting thing about alchemy, and why we're starting here above all things, is that when you follow the text, when you study the ancient texts, the symbology, the philosophical ideas, the things that are in alchemy can be found in essentially every other religion today that we know. So how is that? Why is that? And that's kind of what we're going to delve into today.
Lovely. Lovely.
So let's go back in time to see how this concept of politically motivated propaganda against certain things that aren't Christianity per se, how did it start? And why do we view alchemy as this old, outdated scientific experiments based on gold and as this black magic source of satanic worship? The two correlations that we have with alchemy can be traced back to this time in particular.
The Renaissance began around the 14th century and was marked by a resurgence of learning based on classical sources. There were widespread cultural reforms in education and government, as well as new developments in the fields of art, science, music, and philosophy. The rapid spread of these new ideas throughout Europe was made possible by Gutenberg's printing press, invented in Germany in 1440.
We know that at this time the Catholic Church had been dominating in power, and culturally speaking, what should we value and uphold?
The Protestant Reformation was a major movement within Western Christianity in the late Renaissance, or during the 16th century. This movement posed a religious and political challenge to the Catholic Church, namely against papal states, arising from what was described as errors, abuses, and discrepancies committed by the Catholic Church. This was the emergence of Protestantism.
During this time period, there was a large group of sort of common people, non-church leaders who were questioning this interpretation that the Catholic Church had. One of the main sort of dudes that started it off is Martin Luther. He nailed his thesis onto the door of the Catholic Church as sort of a protest. Demands must be met and things must be changed. Another thing that really happened here that sort of helped propel this movement forward, which is a separation from the Catholic Church, is Gutenberg and the printing press, and the fact that the Bible was finally printed in a language that the people could even read, those who could read. Previous to this, it was in Latin, and so, like I said before, only the Catholic priests, the clergymen, the people within the church's walls had the power, because they were the only ones educated enough to read Latin to understand what the Bible or biblical text was talking about. And therefore, they were the ultimate authority between your experience with God and God himself. So this printing of this Bible in Germany, it was something that was revolutionary, because now you had the power of this interpretation in the hands of the common people outside of the Catholic Church. This whole sort of analysis of this interpretation of this text continued on throughout all of Martin Luther's life, as well as after, and still today. And that started in the Renaissance. That started in the late Renaissance during the Reformation time. You would have these men who would write a book or an article or give a sermon that was recorded and published. People would have access to this, and a lot of people would read this. Martin Luther obviously spent his whole life and career sort of being a part of this conversation about what is this interpretation and what is the right way. He had a series that was compiled in books and articles that were put out called Table Talk. And in one of these table talks, he was talking about alchemy in particular during the time period, and it was published after his death. But what's interesting that he says is, Martin Luther was saying that the science aspect of alchemy, which is this science aspect that you and I are familiar with, turning base metals into gold was something that he liked well, meaning that the science was legit. The other aspect about alchemy that he mentioned is this correlation of significance, divine significance, of the allegorical aspect of the symbolism within alchemy and how that sort of reaffirms and complements Christianity and Christian doctrine and theology. Why is it so interesting that Martin Luther would say that about alchemy? Because Martin Luther and this whole pull away from the Catholic Church was so much about not just the interpretation of the text, but also the symbols and the imagery, the whole idea of a cathedral, walking in and there's these elaborately painted ceilings and stained glass windows and, you know, these buildings that were just so extravagant that represented this domineering power of the Catholic Church. You know, Martin Luther felt like Lutheranism and his version of Christianity, his interpretation of Christ, was one that was much more relatable to a common person. What was okay for Martin Luther is very important during this time period. And the fact that these symbols of alchemy specifically is what he's talking about, it's enlightening to see. This alchemical practice, which has been going on well before Christianity, is something that is so commonly done during the Renaissance time that Martin Luther is familiar with, like, what even it is that they're doing in the science. Not just, you know, did they ever turn this mercury into gold, but why they had this enormous emphasis on each individual phase. They had these elaborate sketches made up with all of this symbolism and layered meanings behind certain things. And that is what he's talking about, is these sketches that were full of symbolism that represented different stages of creating the Philosopher's Stone. And we see that there's proof for this because there was a 14th century Franciscan named John, and he specifically commented on the third phase of the Philosopher's Stone as sort of proof that it reiterates Christ's life. So this third phase in creating the Philosopher's Stone would involve getting mercury, which to an alchemist represented the life force, consciousness, the, you know, soul of a human. That's like the sort of representation of that. He would burn it in this device and it would sort of die and disappear and turn to vapor, which then would kind of turn into a silvery white sparkly dust at the end. And to the alchemist, this was very important and had very symbolic meanings. Like I said, mercury represented, you know, this consciousness. This vapor would be considered like the prima materia, or materia prima, which was like the purest essence of reality or spirit. It would represent spirit. And then the dust that like it transmutes into would be the ascension process. So it's like enlightenment sort of. And to the Franciscan, he saw mercury as Jesus being killed on the cross and then having to go into the fires of hell and conquering that and returning to earth as a completely new being born again, and then ascending into heaven. And so you have this very interesting, very different interpretation of this one process. And so it's interesting that even in this early age of the Renaissance period, the Reformation specifically, where the Lutherans were seeing this alchemy as complementary to Christianity, even moving forward, even this far back in time, which is how you have this like really strange crossover between Christianity iconography and symbolism mixed with alchemy. Like we said, they know that they already feel complementary to each other in the cultural aspect of the day-to-day. Martin Luther was culturally so aware of alchemy that he knew about this phase within the Philosopher's Stone. There is this sort of idea of alchemy as this ancient, outdated science. However, alchemy is the basis of modern science. They invented science, essentially. Everything that we know about science is thanks to these alchemy guys. Remember when I said alchemy is in almost every single other religion? Well, it's in Islam as well. And the Arabic tradition had a well-documented, well-preserved example of alchemy and their scientific methods and processes, specifically when it comes to the chemistry aspect of science. And so chemistry is literally from alchemy, and specifically the Islamic Arabic traditions, because they were the ones that were preserving it and practicing it for all this time when people in Europe had to go in hiding. You can see this alchemical belief system in ancient China and ancient Chinese traditions and ancient Indian traditions in the Vedas. You have this Persian astrology. I mean, and then from the very beginning of time, we have music, mathematics, science, magic. Alchemical texts and traditions are the basis and the origin of all of these things. Interesting.
The early Middle Ages began with the fall of the Roman Empire and is often referred to as the Dark Ages because of its relative scarcity of literary and cultural output. In many parts of Europe, Catholic Christianity was still in its infancy, with the predominant religions being a mix of Arian Christianity and Germanic paganism. The Catholic Church began to legitimize itself in Europe through the Pope being granted papal states, or direct sovereign rule through the Catholic Church.
The Middle Ages was a great time for the Catholic Church to define what it is to be a Christian. And it's also very interesting because during this time, it's also known as the Dark Ages. People are very illiterate. As a child, it's very rare to get past the age of 5. People were dying from diseases. There was the plague. There's just a lot going on at this time that the Catholic Church gaining power was inevitable, I guess. I want to sort of touch on dark magic, sorcery, Satanism, rhetoric, this narrative of this is right and this is wrong when it comes to this magical, divine, ethereal essence of reality. That's kind of happening directly in correlation with the Catholic Church. Like I said, the alchemy in the Renaissance time, especially the scientific aspect of it, was so a part of the culture that it was just a normal thing. Magic, superstition, ritualistic, mystic view of reality was so important and normal during this time period for everybody, including anybody in the church and anybody not. If you were sick, here's like a wolf head amulet to help you. A broken bone, let me cut this off and bleed you out, or whatever. Kind of an obsession with this demonic, evil aspect of reality. If an earthquake happens, it's a demon. If so-and-so dies, it's because they had a demonic presence. This magical way of life where what we would see today as sort of satanic, these pentagrams, these sigils, this, if I draw this particular symbol on top of this drawing of a demon, then it traps them and they can't get me. And that was seen as a godly act. That was seen as a Christian thing to do. You get this sort of blurry view, this undefined view of magic during the Middle Ages or Dark Ages, until the Catholic Church, decided to begin to define these things. Angels versus demons, a spirit that is good versus a spirit that is evil, bad, black, good, holy, white, this definition, this defining of what these mystical, more abstract concepts of reality, especially how it related to spirituality, was being introduced and defined by the Catholic Church during this time. It's interesting to note that biblical text talks about witches or witchcraft, and it refers to it as a man sometimes in the Bible, or a woman sometimes in the Bible. And during this time period, this magic, this, bad magic that you could get accused of was either a man or a woman. It was never one way or the other. But you did have this Holy Inquisition that happened, during the 1100s or the 12th century in France specifically, and you had this idea of ecclesiastical law, which, what happens with texts, any ancient text about any religion, you have some verses that are very vague, you have some concepts theologically that are not quite fully developed or explained in the version of the Bible that we have. And so, especially during this time, you had a lot of church people, a lot of Catholic priests and clergymen and, historians and scientists and philosophers and physicians who didn't want to get murdered by the Catholic Church, who would sort of sympathize with the Catholic Church by helping to hypothesize about what these complex theological concepts could mean, this interpretation of these things and what that would look like culturally speaking. Magic was something that they were addressing. This is where the term heresy versus orthodox really comes into play to anybody that wasn't the Catholic Church. Now, we talked about how there's various Christian sects that were Christian, that had biblical texts that they were studying and following, but that differed interpretations from the Catholic Church. Those were the ones that were heavily focused on. However, there was a book that was put out, one-stop shop with how to find out what is black magic, who is using it, and how to persecute them, kill them, and rid the world of this evil. The Malleus Maleficarium, which is also translated as the Hammer of the Witch. Okay, so a lot of our ideas about witchcraft, Satanism, black magic, evil, things that are heresy according to the Catholic Church, literally come from this book. This book is one of the most influential books, only second to the Bible, in history, as the ultimate authority on what is evil, what is witchcraft, what is black magic. This book was supposedly approved by the Catholic Church, or at least the Pope at the time. The man who wrote it was politically sound as far as the Catholic Church goes and the Pope goes. He was not challenged for 300 years or so. So it's interesting because this book in particular defines witches as women. One of the worst witches you could be, the most evil, disgusting darkness that you could create is to be a midwife, to help a baby be born. That was one of his claims. Of course, this helped to replace midwives and women who were active in childbirth, because that's where women were in society. They were swiftly replaced with a church-ordained and trained male doctor because of this book. If you were unmarried, for instance, an old spinster, which also helped to push marriage through the church in a way that would kind of force control on women even further. The older women in the town were the medicine women. They were the ones that were most knowledgeable, most wise about what herbs would cure what. They lived the longest, right? So they didn't eat the berries that were toxic. Okay, so they could identify these berries will poison you. This plant will, help coagulate your blood. This particular herb or root will help you have contractions faster and help you labor better. And so one of the things that happened was it was very easy to sort of blame these medicine women who were older, these old hags, which was seen as a compliment before this time period. Because of all these plagues, diseases, and all these kinds of things that were happening at the time, alongside of this defining what is evil, that's why midwives were seen as evil, because childbirth was very dangerous and produced death by either the mom or the child or both, more often than not. So there was this superstition around childbirth in general and around medicine in general. And so they would be like, well, you're the one that's killing everybody. You're supposed to be this healer. You're supposed to be this medicine woman. And here you are. This book says that women are witches, and I don't trust you because I'm sick. So you had this easy persecution of medicine women, of unmarried women, of midwives. They would strip you. You would be completely naked. They would search your body for a mole and claim that it was a third nipple to milk the frickin' demons that you serve, apparently. You were tortured, just brutally tortured for days, weeks, however long you would last, until essentially you would confess. And if you didn't confess that you were a witch, then they would continue to torture you. And then when you confessed, you would die. So it's I would confess if I were being tortured just to escape it and die at that point. You know what I'm saying? And so there was this massive propaganda against women by the church that was approved by the church under this guise of defining it as black magic. Okay? So what you need to understand is that these sigils, these rituals, these magic things that existed that might have been used as black magic or white magic did exist, but it was most likely not the people that were being persecuted as witches, because you had these Catholic priests that have been known to have been said that, yes, I am doing black magic, however, I have permission from God, and therefore it is okay, right? You have these alchemists who are 100% doing magic and rituals and have knowledge of, certain days that hold a certain energetic capacity or frequency that would make their spells sort of work better. And you see throughout time, historically speaking, the church is now adopting all of those pagan holidays, right? To represent something that is powerful and meaningful for the church. Energetically speaking, that is witchcraft, that is magic. But of course, if you're a Catholic priest, especially at the time, anything that you do, whether it be healing, divination, you're having a vision explaining God, it's okay, because the people who are in power say it's okay. I'm going to end the Middle Ages with just this reference to one of my favorite artists of all time.
Hildegard von Bingen lived from 1098 to 1179 and was a German Benedictine abbess, or a nun, also referred to as Saint Hildegard. She was a writer, philosopher, composer, Christian mystic, visionary, and one of the best-known composers of sacred monophony. Hildegard was named a Doctor of the Church and thus declared a saint by Pope Benedict XVI in 2012.
Thanks, Josh. So Hildegard is this nun, and you have a lot of people at the time period who are very passionate about spirituality. If you think about it, superstition is something that rules their life. You feel out of control of your experience. The Catholic Church is saying if you don't literally reiterate what I want you to, if you're not married, if you are talking about the church in any sort of way, I'm going to murder you, and there's something you can do about it. There are these plagues, these diseases, poverty, just a lot of really bad things were happening. And if I were alive during that time and I was told that the path of Christianity is something that's going to set you free and give you immortality, and you can, be in communion with God, and, those are great, enticing ideas, especially in the time period of the Middle Ages. So you had a lot of very religious, passionate people. Hildegard was one of them. And she started off as a nun and began to have these visions, these divinations that the Catholic men would have, the priests would have, but of course they were allowed. Hildegard's visions sort of revealed God to be feminine and have these darker magical aspects to her. And she was an author, a philosopher, a scientist, a musician, and a scholar, somebody that studied the texts. So she wasn't just some person on the road just saying something. She was somebody who knew exactly what she was saying. And obviously she was persecuted by the Catholic Church. This was not a good thing to do. And she was sent away. She was banished, essentially. But she and her ideas about God, her interpretations of this presence of defining God and what that meant and what that lifestyle looked like and what kind of magic was okay, was so successful. I mean, she had cults, basically, of all these women that would just follow her, flock to her. She had, when she was banished, she basically was still this nun lady, but she had this huge following of other nuns that would come and want to serve God in her way. The other really cool thing about her is that she is this musician, so she writes these songs directly from her visions of God, from the heavenly realms. She's able to hear these angels, angelic voices singing in her visions, and when she comes back down, she's able to write them because she's so well educated and a musician, like we said, and recreate that heavenly, beautiful sound. is the most well-documented musician of the Middle Ages and has more music physically and historically represented than any other musician during this time period. Like overall, like she's so badass, it's amazing. Not only was she somebody who was super concerned with spirituality, wanted to know the essence and the truth of God, followed every sort of available educational tool that she could, that was given to her at that time. She was persecuted for it. She was banished. She barely escaped with her life, but she was also able to produce the most amount of work, musically speaking, and outweighed every other man, woman, or anything else during her time period. And she is the most recorded artist from this time period today, meaning that people are still so obsessed with her and her music that they are forming choirs, learning her songs, and recording new recordings of these beautiful masterpieces of angelic music. And I think she's amazing, so look up Hildegard.
The 1st century to 6th century AD is referred to as the Classical Era. During this time, Europe, North Africa, and the Near East fell under the rule of the Roman Empire. Christianity had its first appearance, and the Jewish community was removed from Jerusalem. Rome had powerful leaders like Constantine and Julius Caesar, for which the Julian calendar is named.
When we get to this time period, which is the 1st to about the 6th century AD, this is sort of the purest form of alchemy that we really get, even though obviously it goes back way further than that.
Alexandria was founded by Alexander the Great in 331 BC. It's an ancient Greek city. Ptolemy declared himself pharaoh and moved his capital to Alexandria in 305 AD. It became the new center of commerce between Europe and the Indian East, and soon became the largest city in the world. It was the center of Hellenism, or Hermeticism, and was home to the largest Jewish community in the world at the time.
So as Josh mentioned, Alexandria is sort of the culmination of this time period in the world. Scholars from all over the world, from all different religious philosophical belief systems, coming to this one city where there was these multiple schools that studied these texts, these ancient texts. And interpretation was pretty much open. You had a lot of people who were scholars at the time who would know every single word and be able to interpret it into multiple languages. But there had been no defining moment of what is Christianity and what is Islam and what is alchemy and what is Neoplatonism and what is natural philosophy and all of those types of concepts that we have today that are still sort of in our society and we still talk about was going on during this time period, but in a very interesting way. Alexandria was in Egypt, but it was being ruled by the Roman Empire at the time. In Rome, you would have this Greek philosophy, this Greek mythological understanding of reality. However, it is seen in this sort of melting pot of ideas, which were all happening at the same time. You had devout Christian or theologians that would have Christian schools that they were going to where they were studying the Bible and biblical texts. Obviously, we didn't have a full-blown, this is the Bible at the time. It was various books and scriptures, as is any religion, before we have the final text. It is multiple texts from multiple sources, from multiple time periods, from multiple geographical locations, and therefore the interpretations that exist by the time you even get those texts are based in different cultural traditions, languages, geographical locations. And so this interpretation, this discussion is necessary. And this is sort of the first time we see that happening. So you have this Greek influence of Greek mythology. You have obviously this massive Egyptian influence. We're in Egypt. We're surrounded by Egyptian monoliths, and the texts that they were finding, even Christian texts, were coming from these places in Egypt that they were finding all these ancient texts. Okay, so it's very interesting to sort of think about Alexandria as a place and try to really understand what was going on there. This is how we know anything about alchemy, is based on these Hermetic texts. Now, Hermetic texts refers to the author of these texts, which is Hermes Trismegistus. Okay? Hermes Trismegistus is a Greek individual, but he's writing about Egyptian belief systems. The main Hermetic text that we're sort of going to talk about, which is the Hermetica Corpus and the Emerald Tablet of Thoth, which states the 7 Hermetic principles, which are the universal laws of reality. I think the other thing that's really interesting is that Hermes Trismegistus is also known as Hermes thrice born. This number 3 is very important, not only to alchemists and their belief of the 3 planes of existence, physical, mental, and spiritual planes. And whatever happens in my physical plane is also happening on my spiritual plane. So like everything is happening all at once. They're like intertwined. So this number 3, which we know the Trinity in Christianity, is also a fundamental law of reality of God, right? God is 3 in 1. 3 is important to them as well. Trismegistus thrice born. 3. Now why is he 3 times born? Because according to the Emerald Tablet, which is credited, it's literally written, the author is Hermes Trismegistus, he says that he is Thoth and that he is the 3rd incarnation of Thoth. Thoth is an Egyptian god, an ancient Egyptian god that has been worshipped since the beginning of time in Egypt. The first and oldest things that we can find in Egyptology about what they worship, Thoth exists. And just like Christianity, Islam, Judaism, all of these religions that we're talking about, and how you can historically see how they have been shaped by various people with different interpretations of the texts, that was happening in Egypt as well. You can go as far back as you want, but you can see historically that this change of their philosophical beliefs, their religious and spiritual beliefs, are directly tied to the political aspect of their history. Who was in charge? Whoever was ruling Egypt was also the one who had the authority on what the religion was going to be and would change it according to their belief systems. You can see this with the Catholic Church, who was in charge for the majority of our past that we're looking at right now. Thoth, even though religion has been changed throughout all of Egypt's history, Thoth exists as one of the main, most important characters and deities throughout all of it. Hermes is saying that he is the 3rd incarnation of Thoth, which is a pretty high statement. It also talks about how Thoth came to Egypt from Atlantis, which is really cool, because remember how I said I am somebody who believes that we come from a higher civilization, a more advanced civilization spiritually, with technology, that kind of a thing. I am a believer in Atlantis. And any sort of snippet of history that we can confirm, anything about Atlantis, makes me so excited. And I just think that this is really cool, that Hermes is said to be Thoth. Thoth is said to be from Atlantis. He was a high priest in Atlantis, right? So he would have been the authority. He would have been the Catholic priests, the clergymen, the pastors, the person in Atlantis defining what their interpretations of their texts were, what their cultural values were, and how to be a good human being. He was the one who had authority in Atlantis. And according to this Emerald Tablet, when Atlantis sank, the deluge that happened to the whole earth, the big flood, he survived. He took the survivors and came to Egypt, where he ruled as king for 16,000 years. But Thoth was the one who would have handed down this religion from Atlantis to the people. Okay, so he was presenting his belief system about what the world needs to know in order to be great with God. And this Hermetic belief system, through the Emerald Tablet, through Hermes Trismegistus, through the Hermetica Corpus, this resurgence of this Hermetic belief system through these texts would have been a new interpretation of a much older religion given to us by Thoth, according to the belief system of the people that believe in Hermeticism and in these tablets. And I think that's really interesting. I think that if you are a truth seeker, if you're somebody that is trying to figure out why religions have such power, why people in those religious institutions believe the interpretations that they have, and what's the truth? Who is God? What is the truth about reality? And I think that if you study these Hermetic principles and you sort of try to go there in your mind and just step outside of your own worldview a little bit, to me, it becomes just so encouraging and interesting because, again, this is like the purest form that we have. This is the oldest example of what God is, how to define reality and spirituality and the mystical, abstract concepts. Like, everything is explained through these Hermetic principles and through this belief, this religion of alchemy. So we're going to go through each individual principle one by one in their own video after this. It's a series that I'm going to do. I'm starting the series off with this: what is alchemy, and why do we think these things about alchemy? And then we're going to go through each of these principles one by one in depth and try to explain what it means. I grew up in an environment that was extremely legalistic, evangelical, Protestant, sort of Calvinist perspective of religion, spirituality. And when I left that world, I was obsessed with trying to figure out this connection to the divine that I had experienced in this childhood setting. But why didn't I fit in? Why didn't I agree with these interpretations, these lifestyle choices, these cultural values that they were trying to uphold? And so that led me down a path of studying various religions, sciences, philosophy is something that I'm super passionate about. And when we step outside of our worldview for the first time, or our religious view for the first time, fear is something that is very prevalent, specifically if you come from a Christian background, because fear is the basis of their agenda for you. Your spirituality sort of relies on you fearing hell, which is not even a Christian concept, which we'll get to in another video. But I think that it's time. We live in a time where we have to be the ones to pick up the texts and ask for ourselves, what is the interpretation that makes sense for us? What as a society do we value? We are being asked these questions whether or not you realize it or not. You are participating in this conversation whether or not you're realizing it. If you are a part of the social justice movement, if you are concerned about humanitarian efforts, environmental efforts, because if the basis of reality can be proven in a spiritual text, and the application of those belief systems really will make the world a better place, now is the time to figure out if that's true. And I think that we need to be the ones to analyze and interpret for ourselves what is true, what is right, what can be applicable, and what values should we carry on and pass down to the next generation. Because right now we are in a time period where nothing is certain. Anything that has happened in the past, any sort of socially accepted norm or religiously accepted norm, spiritually accepted norm, statistically speaking, if you look, spirituality is sort of the new norm. People know that there's something out there, but they don't know how to define it. They don't know what it means. They don't disagree with multiple paths to finding that way. So if you will join me, if you will step outside of your worldview and realize that fear is the opposite of truth. Thoth, actually, is quoted in the Emerald Tablet as being the first person to say, truth will set you free, or knowledge is the only thing that can free you from bondage. If you're a truth seeker, alchemy is where you need to start. Thoth is somebody you need to look into. These truths, these pure forms of spiritual concepts that we have access to is so important for us, and we cannot get blinded by the propaganda that has been put forth in front of us about certain belief systems by saying, oh, it's evil, it's satanic, gonna lead you down the wrong path. That spirit is bad versus my spirit, which is good. I ask you to trust yourself, your intuition, and follow your gut. If this is pulling on you, if this is something that's interesting to you, I hope to see you guys next time. Subscribe, and I will see you in the comment section.